Stop waiting to be free. A new way to think about time, money, and freedom. By Sébastien Guénette. sctsuite.com. It is not that we have a short time to live, but that we waste a great deal of it. Seneca on the shortness of life. Copyright notice. The ideas in this book are meant to be shared. You are welcome to pass it on, quote from it, and share it with anyone you think needs to read it. The only thing I ask is that you do not sell it or claim it as your own work. Disclaimer. This book is written for educational and philosophical purposes. Nothing in these pages constitutes financial, investment, legal, or tax advice. The ideas, perspectives, and examples shared here are intended to encourage reflection and independent thinking, not to direct any specific financial decision. Any references to financial systems, tools, or approaches are provided for context only. All financial decisions carry risk, and outcomes vary by individual. The author does not manage client capital and does not provide personalized financial advice. You are encouraged to consult qualified professionals before making decisions that affect your financial situation. Past results and examples mentioned are illustrative and do not guarantee future outcomes. All decisions remain your own responsibility. Message from the author. Let me ask you something. If nothing in your life had to stay the same, what would you change first? Not the dramatic version of that question, not the fantasy, the honest one. If the financial pressure lifted, if the obligations loosened just enough, if you had genuine permission to reorganize your days around what actually matters to you, what would look different? Where would you be? What would you stop doing? What would you finally start? Most people, when they sit with that question long enough, realize the answer is not that complicated. They want more time with the people they love. They want to stop spending the majority of their waking hours doing work that feels disconnected from anything meaningful. They want to travel, or rest, or create, or simply be present without the weight of financial stress sitting on top of every decision they make. They want to feel like their life belongs to them. And then, almost immediately, they talk themselves out of it. Because they are being realistic. Because they have responsibilities. Because that kind of life is for other people. Because they will get there eventually. Once everything settles down, once they save a little more, once the timing is better. That conversation, the one between what you actually want and what you have convinced yourself is possible, is what this book is about. I'm not going to tell you what to want. That is not my place, and it would not be useful. What I am going to do is ask better questions than the ones most people ask themselves about how they are spending their lives and why. Because in my experience, most people are not failing to build a life they want because they lack intelligence or discipline or opportunity. They are failing because they have never clearly defined what they are actually building toward. They are running a race without knowing where the finish line is, following a path that someone else laid out, measuring progress by metrics that have nothing to do with the life they genuinely want to live. There is a word that gets in the way of this conversation, more than almost any other, and that word is retirement. Most people think of retirement as the goal. Work long enough, save enough, and eventually you earn the right to stop. But when you press people on what they actually want, almost nobody describes a life of doing nothing. They do not want to stop working in any meaningful sense of that word. They want to stop doing meaningless work. They want to stop being forced to show up somewhere they do not want to be, doing something that does not matter to them, for someone else's benefit because the bills require it. The goal is not to stop. The goal is to choose. Real retirement, the kind worth building toward, is not the end of contribution. It is the beginning of intentional living. It is the moment you transition out of the life you have been living by obligation and into the life you have always wanted to build by choice. Some people find that transition at 65. Others find it at 40. Some are building toward it right now in their 20s with more clarity than most people twice their age. The age is not the point. The freedom to choose is. And that is a very different target to aim at. Freedom means something different to everyone. For some people, it is financial independence that removes the anxiety from everyday decisions. For others, it is the ability to be physically present with their children during the years that matter most. Some are chasing the space to finally pursue something they have been postponing for a decade. Others are simply looking for the dignity of spending their energy on work that feels like their own. There is no universal definition, but there is a universal experience of its absence. And most people know exactly what that feels like, even if they have stopped naming it. This book is short by design. It is meant to be consumed in one sitting, returned to when you need it, and worked through honestly using the worksheet that accompanies it. It is not a dense argument you need to analyze. It is a conversation you need to have with yourself. The only thing I will ask of you is this. As you move through these pages, resist the instinct to read passively. The questions are real. The gaps they point to are real. And the distance between where most people are and where they actually want to be is almost always smaller than it appears, once they are honest about both sides of it. You picked this up for a reason. Let's figure out what that reason is. Sébastien Guénette. Part 1. The question you've never honestly asked. 1.1. What do you actually want? If I sat across from you right now, set 2 drinks on the table, and asked you a single question, this would be it. Not what you do for a living, not where you see yourself in 5 years, just this. What do you actually want? Most people answer that question with a list of things. A bigger house, a better car, a certain amount of money in the bank, more time, less stress, a trip somewhere they've been postponing. And those answers are not wrong exactly, but they're also not honest. They are inherited. They are the language of a culture that taught you to want what is acceptable to want. And they rarely describe the texture of the life you would actually choose if no one were watching. Try this instead. Forget the things. Picture an ordinary Tuesday, 2 years from now in the life you would build if every external pressure suddenly went quiet. What time do you wake up? What is the first thing you do? Who do you have breakfast with? What is the work you sit down to, if you sit down to any at all? What is the conversation you have with yourself in the mirror that morning? That picture, if you let it land, is closer to what you actually want than any number you have ever written down. The reason most people never reach the life they want is not that the life is unreachable. It is that they have never clearly described it to themselves. They are aiming at someone else's target. They are using a map drawn by people who have never been to the place they are trying to go. Marcus Aurelius kept private notebooks he never intended anyone to read. In them, he reminded himself, repeatedly, that he could leave life at any moment, and that this fact should determine how he spent his time. Not as a warning, as a clarification. Most of what occupies our minds on any given day is noise. The things we worry about, the approval we chase, the discomfort we avoid, almost none of it survives honest contact with the reality that our time here is limited. You have a finite number of mornings ahead of you. The more important question is whether you have ever genuinely decided what you want to do with them. So, before you turn the page, sit with this. Answer honestly, not automatically. What do you actually want? And how long have you been pretending that the answer is something else? 1.2. The life you're postponing. There is a sentence almost everyone has said to themselves at some point, usually on a Sunday evening or in the quiet moments before sleep. I will get to that later. Later when the kids are older, later when the business is more established, later when I have a little more saved, later when work calms down, later when the timing makes more sense. Later, later, later. Later is where most lives go to die quietly. Look around you. Look at the people in their 50s and 60s who finally have the financial freedom to do the things they always said they would do. And notice how often they say some version of the same thing. I should have done it sooner. I missed those years with my kids. My body cannot quite do the trip I was saving for. The marriage did not survive the decade I gave to the company. I did not realize how fast it would all go. These are not sad people. Most of them are decent, hardworking, responsible people who did exactly what they were told to do. They followed the path. They sacrificed in their 20s and 30s so they could enjoy life later. They were patient. And later finally arrived. And they discovered that later is not a place. It is a lie we tell ourselves when we do not know how to start now. There is a version of you that was genuinely excited about your own life. Somewhere along the way, under the weight of obligations and responsibilities, and the relentless pressure of keeping everything running, that version got quieter. Not gone, just postponed. The trip, the conversation, the creative work, the relationship that needs attention, the thing you have always known you were meant to do. None of it feels urgent enough to act on today, which is why it keeps getting moved to tomorrow. But urgent and important are not the same thing. Urgent work is loud and immediate, and it always has a reason why it cannot wait. Important work is patient. It sits with you for years without demanding anything. And that patience is not a gift. It is the cruelest kind of deadline, because by the time you feel it, a significant portion of your time is already gone. Ask yourself this honestly. What are you currently postponing? Not the small things, the big ones. The ones that, if you're being truthful with yourself, are tied to who you actually want to be. What moment with someone you love are you assuming will still be available when you're finally ready for it? What version of yourself are you waiting to become before you give yourself permission to start living? You do not have to answer those questions for anyone but yourself, but you do have to answer them. Because the only thing more expensive than starting now is continuing to wait. 1.3. The cost of becoming someone you're not. There is a quieter cost to the life most people are living, and it is harder to see than the cost of postponed dreams. It is the cost of identity. Somewhere between 20 and 40, most people make a set of trades they never really agree to out loud. They take a job that makes sense and stay longer than they planned. They adjust what they say depending on who is listening. They learn which version of themselves gets the best response in the room, and they lead with that version, so consistently it starts to feel like the real one. The parts that do not fit get quieter. Not removed, just deprioritized. Just set aside for now. Just saved for later, when there is more time and less at stake. And because the world rewards the performance becomes the identity. Most people do not notice when that happens. That is the point. You did not plan to become this version of yourself. You drifted into it, one reasonable compromise at a time. Alan Watts had a way of describing this. He talked about how we are taught to confuse the menu with the meal. We are handed a script of what success is supposed to look like, and we spend our lives perfecting our delivery of that script, while quietly forgetting that the script was never actually our story. We are told who to be, what to want, what to fear, what to celebrate. Then we follow along, because following along is what gets you the things the script promised. Until one day, you sit with the question of who you actually are, separating from your job title and your obligations and your roles, and you realize you are not entirely sure anymore. If that question makes you uncomfortable, that discomfort is information. It is not weakness. It is the part of you that has been waiting patiently for a turn to speak. Try this. Think of yourself at age 10. Take a moment to focus on the mind state of that 10-year-old version of yourself and what that kid believed to be important. What did that kid love doing for no reason at all? What did that kid imagine adulthood would feel like? Now, imagine that 10-year-old watching a normal week of your current life? Would they recognize you? Would they be impressed? Or would they quietly wonder where you went? This is not about regret. Regret is useless. This is about location. You cannot navigate to where you want to go if you are not honest about where you are. And most people are not honest about where they are because the honesty is inconvenient. It implies that something has to change. Something does have to change. That is what the rest of this book is about. Part 2. The System You Were Handed. 2.1. The Promise That Was Made to You. There is a deal that was offered to you, probably by your parents, your teachers, and every well-meaning adult who shaped your early sense of what a responsible life looks like. The deal sounds something like this: work hard, get a stable job, save a portion of every paycheck, diversify across a basket of low-cost index funds, or whatever the equivalent advice was in your generation. Be patient, avoid risk, trust the long term. Do this for 40 years, and at the end of it, you will have enough to stop working and live the life you want. That deal was not a lie when it was made. It was the right deal for a different world. It was built in a time when an income could support a family, when housing was affordable on a middle-class salary, when defined benefit pensions were standard, when inflation was contained, when a career meant staying with the same company for decades, and when the financial returns of slow and steady investing were generous enough to genuinely build wealth across a working lifetime. In that world, the deal worked. People retired with security. The math made sense. That world no longer exists. Wages have stagnated relative to the cost of housing, healthcare, and education. The retirement vehicles built for previous generations have been quietly replaced with structures that put far more risk on the individual. Inflation has compounded in ways that have eroded the real value of long-term savings. Markets have become more volatile, more correlated, and more dominated by institutions running strategies that ordinary investors cannot access. The promise that patience and discipline alone would deliver the kind of life most people imagined when they signed up for the deal has quietly become something closer to a hope than a plan. This is not a complaint. It is a description. The point is not to be angry at the people who passed the deal down to you. They believed it. In their time, it was largely true. The point is to recognize that the assumptions you may have inherited about how a life is supposed to work financially were built for an economy that has changed beneath your feet, and that no one has been particularly motivated to come tell you the deal has been amended. The institutions benefiting from the old deal are not in a hurry to update you on its current terms. The financial industry that grew up around the old deal still sells its products on the assumption that the old deal works. The cultural narrative that frames the old deal as the responsible choice still rewards the people who follow it most loyally, even as it quietly fails to deliver what it promised. You are allowed to ask whether the deal still works. You are allowed to look at the numbers honestly. You are allowed to wonder whether the path you are on is actually leading to where you were told it would lead. Asking the question does not make you reckless. Refusing to ask it is what's reckless. 2.2. Redefining Retirement. The word retirement is one of the most damaging words in the modern vocabulary, and almost no one questions it. When you ask someone what retirement means, they will tell you it is the moment you stop working, the end of the career, the reward for decades of effort, the point at which you finally get to sit on a beach somewhere and do nothing. That definition has been sold so consistently for so long that most people accept it without ever asking whether it actually describes what they want. It does not. When you press people, almost no one wants to do nothing. Doing nothing is depressing. Humans are wired to contribute, to build, to create, to be useful to the people around them. What people actually want when they say they want to retire is something more specific and more honest. They want to stop being forced. They want to stop showing up to a job they would not choose if money were not involved. They want to stop trading their best hours for a paycheck that barely keeps pace with the cost of living. They want to stop waking up to an alarm that exists only because someone else's calendar requires it. They want to stop performing the role of the responsible adult inside a system that does not actually serve them. What they want is not the end of work. It is the end of obligation. If you allow yourself to redefine retirement honestly, it stops being a finish line at the end of a 40-year tunnel and starts being a question you can ask yourself today. The question is not when can I stop working? The question is how soon can I retire from the life I have been living and start living the life I actually want to build? For some people, that transition will happen in their 60s, the way the old script promised. For others, it can happen in their 50s, their 40s, or even their 30s. There are people in their 20s right now who are building toward this kind of transition with more clarity than most people 3 decades older. The age does not matter. What matters is whether you have a real definition of what you are trying to retire from and what you're trying to retire into. Retire from meaningless work. Retire into work that matters to you. Retire from financial pressure. Retire into financial space. Retire from a calendar full of obligations. Retire into a calendar shaped around the things you actually care about. Retire from the version of you that you became to survive. Retire into the version of you that you originally were. Once you reframe the word this way, almost everything in this book changes. You stop asking, how much do I need to never work again? And you start asking, how much do I need to choose how I spend my time? The first number is intimidating and abstract. The second number is achievable and personal. And the difference between them is often a difference between a life of waiting and a life of building. Retirement is not a date. It is a decision. The decision to stop pretending that the life you actually want is something you have to earn the right to live. 2.3. Time is the real currency. Money is what most people obsess over. Time is what they actually have less of. If you sat down with a piece of paper and wrote out the rest of your life in weeks, the way Tim Urban once visualized in a now famous essay, you would find the number unsettling. The average human lifespan, broken into weeks, fits on a single page. You can see the whole thing at once. The weeks you have already used, the weeks you have left, the weeks you will spend sleeping, working, commuting, scrolling, the weeks you will actually spend present with the people and the work that matter most to you. That last category is much, much smaller than you assume. Money is something you can lose and rebuild. People have gone bankrupt and become wealthy again. Markets have crashed and recovered. Currencies have collapsed and been replaced. There is no version of money that is permanent. There is no version of time that is not. Once an hour is gone, it is gone. There is no replacement. There is no compound growth that makes up for it. There is no later that returns it to you with interest. The single most expensive transaction most people make in their lives is trading hours of their finite life for money they will eventually use to buy back free time they no longer have. That transaction repeated for 40 years is the default plan, and almost no one does the math on what it actually costs. Here's a simpler way to think about it. Every hour you spend doing work that does not matter to you is an hour you have to subtract from your real wealth. Money in the bank is not wealth. Time in your life is wealth. $1 million accumulated by spending 40 years doing work that drained you is not actually $1 million. It is $1 million minus the price of a life. That is not an argument against working. Working is part of being human. It is an argument for being honest about what you are spending and what you are buying. The question is not how much money do I have. The question is how much of my time is actually mine. How many hours a week do I get to choose how I use? How many of those hours go to things I would do even if no one paid me for them? How many of them disappear into work I tolerate, commitments I never fully agreed to, and obligations I am no longer sure why I accepted. Time is the only currency that matters. Money is just a tool to buy more of it. The system most people are operating inside has confused the two, and the longer they operate inside it without noticing, the more expensive the confusion becomes. 2.4. The silent tax. There is a tax most people are paying that does not show up on any government form. It does not have a name in everyday conversation. Most people feel it without realizing what it is, and they spend their lives trying to outrun it without ever clearly identifying the thing they are running from. It is the silent tax of inflation, lifestyle creep, and quiet erosion. Inflation is the part most people understand on the surface. The dollar in your hand today buys less than the dollar in your hand last year, and significantly less than the dollar your parents earned at your age. Prices rise. Wages do not always rise as fast. The official inflation numbers, which already feel high, are almost always lower than the actual cost increases you experience in housing, healthcare, education, and food. The result is that the savings you are diligently building are being quietly devalued in the background, often faster than they are growing, even when the headline numbers on your statement look fine. Lifestyle creep is the second layer. As your income rises, your expenses rise to match it. The bigger paycheck becomes the bigger apartment. The bigger apartment becomes the bigger commitment. The new car becomes the assumed standard. The dinners out become the new normal. The promotion that was supposed to give you breathing room ends up giving you the same level of stress at a higher dollar amount, because your life has quietly expanded to absorb the additional income before you noticed it happening. The third layer is the most subtle. It is the slow erosion of energy and ambition that comes from running on a treadmill that never seems to slow down. By your mid-30s, most people who have followed the standard path are no longer building. They are maintaining. They are protecting. They are managing the structure of a life that already exists. And they have less and less of the surplus capacity that their 20s had for trying new things, taking new risks, or building anything outside the lines. Add these three taxes together, and you get a quietly dangerous outcome. You can be earning more than you ever have, saving what feels like a responsible amount, and still falling behind in real terms. You can be doing everything you were told to do, and still feel like the finish line is moving away from you faster than you can run toward it. This is not because you are lazy. It is not because you are bad with money. It is because the system was not designed to make you free. It was designed to make you stable. And stable is a much smaller goal than free. The first step toward escaping this tax is naming it. The second step is realizing that the tools the previous generation used to outrun it were not designed for the speed at which it now compounds. That is the conversation we are about to have. 2.5. Safe is not the same as free. There is a word that gets used as a substitute for freedom, and it has confused more people about how to build a meaningful life than almost any other word in personal finance. That word is safe. Safe is presented as the responsible choice. Safe is the conservative portfolio. Safe is the steady job. Safe is the mortgage on the modest house. Safe is the path of least friction, the path your parents would approve of, the path that makes sense to anyone you might ask. Safe is what you choose when you are being a grown-up. Safe is also not freedom. Safe is what you choose when you have decided that minimizing the chance of loss is more important than maximizing the chance of building the life you actually want. And that calculation makes sense in some moments. There are times in life when stability is genuinely the right priority. There are seasons that call for it. But most people who default to safe do not realize they have made a calculation. They have simply followed an instinct, and the instinct came from somewhere they have never examined. The problem with safe is that it has a hidden cost, and the hidden cost is time. Safe almost always means slow. Slow means decades. Decades mean that the version of you who finally arrives at the destination is not the same version of you who left. The patience that safe demands is paid in years of your life, and those years come out of the same finite supply you read about a few chapters ago. There is a difference between safety as a tool and safety as an identity. Safety as a tool says, I will protect what I have built so I can continue building. Safety as an identity says, I will not risk what I have, even if it means I never build what I actually want. The first is wisdom. The second is fear pretending to be wisdom. Most people never examine which one they are operating inside. If safe were actually delivering freedom, the people who have followed it most loyally would be the freest people you know. Look around. Are they? The most reliable, responsible, by-the-book people in your life? The ones who have done everything they were told to do? Are they actually living the lives you would describe as free? Or are they living lives that are stable, predictable, and quietly constrained by the same obligations they had 10 or 20 years ago? This is not a criticism of those people. It is a question about the framework they were handed. The framework promised that safe would lead to free. For most of them, it has not. You do not have to abandon safety to be free, but you do have to recognize that they are not the same thing, and that confusing them is one of the most expensive mistakes you can make. Freedom requires risk. It requires willingness to do something the people around you would not necessarily do. It requires building structures inside your life that prioritize choice over predictability. It requires learning to think for yourself about what is worth protecting and what is worth pursuing. Which brings us to the next question. If the system you were handed is not built to set you free, what is? Part 3. A different way to see the world. 3.1. The pressure that blocks purpose. There is a strange thing that happens when people finally remove a significant amount of financial pressure from their lives. They expect to feel free. Often what they feel first is disoriented. For years, the pressure has been the loudest signal in their life. Pay the rent, cover the bills, make the next deadline, hit the next target. The pressure has been telling them what to do, where to be, what to focus on, every single day. It has been so consistent for so long that they have confused the pressure with direction. When the pressure suddenly drops, they do not know what to do with the silence. That silence is one of the most important experiences a human being can have, and it is one of the rarest. Most people are too busy surviving to ever sit inside it. They run from one obligation to the next, fill any empty hours with distraction, and avoid the quiet at all costs because the quiet asks questions they are not ready to answer. What do I actually want? What is actually mine? Who am I? When am I not being needed, paid, demanded of, or watched? I grew up around a different kind of thinking than most people did. My mother has spent her life helping people sit inside that exact silence. To slow down, to listen, to recognize what is theirs and what is just noise they have absorbed from the world around them. For most of my early life, I respected what she did without fully understanding it. I was building things. I was chasing results. The deeper work she was doing seemed like a different domain from the one I was operating in. The older I get, the more I see that we have been working on the same problem from opposite ends. She helps people remove inner pressure so they can hear themselves more clearly. The work I do is meant to remove outer pressure so they can do the same thing. Both paths lead to the same room, the room where you can finally sit with yourself and ask what you actually want, without the answer being shaped by what you have to do tomorrow morning to survive. Purpose does not appear when you go looking for it inside a life that is full of pressure. It appears when there is enough space for it to be heard. This is one of the most underappreciated reasons to take freedom seriously. It is not just about lifestyle. It is not just about choice. It is about creating the conditions in which the deeper questions can finally come up to the surface, where you can actually look at them. You do not need a mystical experience for this to happen. You just need quiet. The pressure has been so constant for so long that most people have never had a real chance to know who they are underneath it. Freedom is what gives you that chance. That is what makes it worth building. 3.2. What freedom actually gives you. When people imagine freedom, they usually imagine it from the outside. The beach, the schedule, the bank account, the big picture of what their life would look like if money stopped being the constraint. The actual experience of freedom is much smaller and much more interesting than that. Real freedom is the morning you wake up without an alarm, and your first thought is not about something you have to do. It is the afternoon you spend with your child without your phone in your pocket, because there's nothing on it that requires you. It is the conversation with your partner that lasts an hour because neither of you is rushing somewhere else. It is the long walk you take alone in the middle of a Tuesday because you can. It is the quiet realization, sometime in the second hour of doing nothing in particular, that you are not anxious. The pressure is not there. The clock is not running. You are not behind on anything. That experience, repeated, is what changes a person. I had a version of this earlier than I expected. One of my first concrete goals when I started building was to retire my parents. I wanted to make sure that the people who had given me everything would never again have to think about money the way they had to think about it when I was growing up. That goal happened earlier than I had planned for, and the moment it happened, I expected to feel something dramatic. A finish line crossed, a wave of satisfaction. What I felt was quieter than that. It was the absence of a specific kind of background tension I had been carrying for years without knowing I was carrying it. And underneath the absence, a question began to surface. If I have already done the thing I thought was the goal, what now? That question is one of the most important questions a person can sit with, and you do not have to retire your parents to encounter it. It comes for anyone who actually creates space in their life. Once the survival pressure is reduced, you have to face the deeper question. What is your life actually for? This is what freedom gives you. It does not give you happiness exactly. Happiness is its own thing, with its own rules. Freedom gives you the conditions under which you can finally meet yourself, undefended, without the noise of obligation, drowning out whatever it is you actually came here to do. Some people meet that version of themselves and decide to spend more time with their family. Some decide to build something they have been meaning to build for years. Some decide to learn a new skill, change careers, leave a city, start or end a relationship, write a book, take a year off, get healthy, slow down, or speed up. There is no correct answer. The point is that you finally get to ask the question. For most people, that is the entire prize. Everything else, the lifestyle, the travel, the nice things, the comfort, is a side effect. The real prize is the room to finally hear yourself. 3.3. Learning to think for yourself. The most important skill you can develop is the ability to think clearly without permission. This sounds obvious. It is not. The world we live in is built to discourage this exact skill in subtle, constant ways. We are taught, from a young age, to defer to authority, to value credentials, to trust experts, to follow paths that have been validated by other people. Most of those instincts are useful in some doses. The problem is that they accumulate, and by adulthood, most people have lost the capacity to actually examine an idea on its own merits, separate from who is presenting it and what room they are presenting it in. I was raised differently than most people I have met. My mother treated me like an adult from the time I could form sentences. I was given a real voice in family decisions when I was 5 years old. My opinions were not dismissed because of my age, and they were not flattered because of it either. They were taken seriously, examined, and either accepted or pushed back on with reasons. I learned early what it felt like to be in a room where my thinking actually mattered. There's a small story I think about often. I was maybe 7 years old, standing at the top of a flight of stairs. I told my mother, in the cocky way kids do, that I was going to jump down the whole flight at once. Most parents would have said no. Mine said something different. She said calmly, "If you really believe you're ready to do it, go ahead." I did not jump. I stood there for a long time. Then I walked back down. A few weeks later, I jumped one stair. Then two. Then more. It took me months to actually do the full flight. By the time I did, I was no longer cocky about it, and I had learned something I could not have learned any other way. The decision was mine. The risk was mine. The judgment of whether I was ready was mine, and I had been trusted to figure that out. That single way of being raised shaped almost everything about how I approach the world now. I never went to college. I never went to university. I taught myself almost everything I have used to build a life I have today. By reading, by trying, by failing, by adjusting, and by trusting my own ability to evaluate whether something made sense rather than waiting to be told that it did. This is not a recommendation that you skip school. That is your decision and depends on what you are trying to build. It is an invitation to look at how often you outsource your thinking. How many of the choices you have made in the last 10 years did you actually make? How many of them did you accept from a culture, a family, a peer group, or an industry that handed you a default? Alan Watts had a phrase for this. The map is not the territory. The plan is not the life. The advice is not the answer. Other people's frameworks are useful tools, but they are not substitutes for the actual experience of looking at your own situation honestly and asking whether what you are doing is what you would do if you were starting from scratch right now. You will never build a life that is genuinely yours by following a path designed by people who are trying to build their own. The willingness to think for yourself, to question what you have been handed, to test ideas against your own reality rather than someone else's authority, is the foundation underneath every other decision in this book. Practice it. It is a muscle. The more you use it, the stronger it gets. 3.4. The world is accelerating. Are you? The single most important thing happening in the world right now is the rate at which it is changing. Industries that took 50 years to mature are being reorganized in 5. Skills that took decades to learn are being automated. Information that used to be locked behind institutions is now available to anyone with an internet connection. Capital is moving faster. Decisions are made faster. Opportunities appear and disappear faster than at any point in modern history. The gap between the people who are paying attention to this and the people who are still operating on assumptions from 20 years ago is widening every month. You can feel it without being able to name it. The sense that everyone around you is somehow keeping up with something you cannot quite identify. The vague anxiety that the rules have changed and no one has explained the new ones. The strange feeling that the things you were taught about how to build a life no longer fit the world you are actually living in. That feeling is accurate. Artificial intelligence, in particular, is reshaping the economic landscape faster than most people are willing to look at directly. Entire categories of work that were considered safe a decade ago are no longer safe. Entire categories of opportunity that did not exist a decade ago are now obvious if you know where to look. The institutions that have always controlled access to certain kinds of leverage, certain kinds of information, certain kinds of returns, are quietly losing their monopoly because the technology behind their advantage is becoming available to ordinary people at a speed almost no one is processing. There is a temptation to respond to this by looking away, to stay loyal to the old plan, to tell yourself that change is overhyped, that the basics still work, that patience and diversification will sort it out, that the people talking about how the world is changing are exaggerating to sell something. Some of them are, some of them are not. The willingness to tell the difference is itself a skill, and it requires you to look at the world directly rather than through the comforting filter of how you wish it still worked. The people who adapt to this acceleration will not necessarily be the smartest people in the room. They will be the ones who notice it early, take it seriously, and make small, structural changes in how they are operating before the larger changes force their hand. The people who do not adapt will not necessarily be punished dramatically. They will simply continue running on a system that is quietly working less and less well, until one day they realize they have spent 20 years saving toward a target that has been moving away from them the entire time. This book is not a prediction. It is a permission slip. Permission to look at the world as it actually is. Permission to update what you believe based on what is actually happening rather than what you were told to expect. Permission to consider that the path that worked for your parents may not be the path that works for you, and that responding intelligently to that fact is not reckless. It is responsible. The world is accelerating. The only question is whether you are. Part 4. A path worth considering. 4.1. The map is not the territory. Alan Watts liked to remind people that the map is not the territory, the menu is not the meal. The word water will not get you wet. Most of human suffering comes from confusing a representation of something with the thing itself. This is one of the most important ideas in the entire book, and it applies directly to the way most people think about money. The financial industry, as it exists today, is mostly in the business of selling maps, models, projections, forecasts, strategies that worked in some past environment under some specific conditions. Those maps are useful in the same way any map is useful. They orient you. They give you a sense of the terrain. They reduce the complexity of a confusing landscape into something you can think about. But the map is not the territory. The thing itself, the actual market, the actual economy, the actual life you are trying to build, is more textured and more dynamic than any map can capture. The model that worked in 1985 is not the world of 2026. The strategy that delivered for your father is not necessarily the strategy that will deliver for you. The advice that has been packaged and resold for decades by an industry whose business model depends on the advice continuing to make sense is, at this point, often closer to a religion than a tool. I'm not saying any of this to make you cynical. Cynicism is just another kind of laziness. I'm saying it because the willingness to update your map is one of the most valuable habits you can build in a world that is changing as fast as the one we are living in. What does updating your map actually look like? It looks like asking every few years whether the assumptions you were operating under are still accurate. It looks like reading sources you would not normally read. It looks like having conversations with people who are doing things differently and being curious about why. It looks like noticing when the standard advice you were given keeps failing to deliver the standard outcomes it promises, and being willing to consider that the advice itself might need an update rather than concluding that you have somehow failed to follow it correctly. Most people will not do any of this. They will stay with the map they were handed. They will read the same sources, talk to the same people, follow the same advice, and feel responsible for doing so. The fact that the map is not the territory will not occur to them, because the people who handed it to them spoke with such confidence and authority. You have an advantage available to you that most people do not use. The advantage is willingness. Willingness to question, to update, to look at the territory directly. That willingness is what makes the rest of this section even worth reading. If you have it, what comes next will be useful. If you do not, no system, no strategy, no opportunity will save you, because you will keep mistaking the menu for the meal until the meal is gone. 4.2. What the institutions never told you. For most of modern financial history, the largest banks, hedge funds, and institutional asset managers have operated with tools the public did not have access to. They had faster information. They had better models. They had teams of quantitative analysts running strategies that were mathematically more sophisticated than anything available to a retail investor. They had relationships, infrastructure, and computational capacity that allowed them to take advantage of opportunities that ordinary people could not even see. The result, over decades, was a quiet but enormous gap between the kind of returns institutions were able to generate for themselves and the kind of returns the public was offered through retail products. This is not a conspiracy. It is just how the industry was structured. The advice given to the public, the long-term, low-cost, diversified, patient approach, was given in part because that approach was the best the industry could offer to people who did not have access to the more sophisticated tools. The institutions kept those tools for themselves, not necessarily out of malice, but because that was the only audience the tools were designed for. The math required to use them, the capital thresholds, the technological infrastructure, all of it was built for institutional scale. That structural reality has been changing very quickly in the last several years. The same kinds of computational tools that institutions use to keep behind a wall of expense and expertise are now becoming available to ordinary people in the form of software. Strategies that were once limited to professional desks can now be run from a personal account. Frameworks that used to require teams of analysts can now be executed by systems that operate continuously, do not get tired, do not get emotional, and do not deviate from the logic they were designed around. Most people do not know this is happening. The financial industry that benefits from the old structure is not in a hurry to inform them. The cultural narrative around personal finance still emphasizes the same 5 or 6 pieces of standard advice that have been emphasized for decades, even though the underlying landscape they were built for has shifted significantly. I am not going to give you specific products in this chapter. That is not the purpose of this book. What I will tell you is this. There are systems now available to ordinary people that were unavailable a decade ago. They are not magic. They are not get-rich-quick schemes. They are software-driven approaches to capital that operate with structure, with rules, with defined parameters, and with the kind of mathematical discipline that institutions have used to outperform retail investors for decades. The fact that these systems exist does not mean they are right for everyone. It does not mean they replace traditional approaches entirely. It means that the menu of options available to a person who wants to take their financial future seriously is meaningfully different in 2026 than it was in 1996. And the willingness to even know that this menu exists is, by itself, a competitive advantage in a world where most people are still ordering from a menu that has not been updated in 30 years. That is not advice. It is information. What you do with it is up to you. 4.3. Systems built for the world as it is. There is a beautiful difference between a strategy and a system. A strategy is a plan that depends on a person executing it. A system is a structure that runs whether or not anyone is paying attention. Most people who try to build wealth are running strategies. They have a plan they're supposed to follow. They're supposed to save a certain amount, invest in certain things, rebalance at certain intervals, and stay disciplined through emotional swings. The problem with strategies is that they fail at exactly the moment they are most needed. They fail when the market is falling and fear takes over. They fail when life gets busy and attention drifts. They fail when the human running them is tired, distracted, or convinced that this time is different. Systems, by contrast, do not fail for those reasons. A well-designed system has the discipline built into it. It does not need you to remain disciplined. It just needs you to set it up correctly and let it run. The world has changed in a way that makes systems much more accessible to ordinary people than they used to be. The same kind of structured, rule-based, software-driven approaches that have always been available to institutions are now available, in some form, to anyone willing to learn about them. This does not mean every system is good. It does not mean systems eliminate risk. It means that the menu of tools available to a serious person has expanded significantly in the last few years, and most people are not paying attention to that expansion. I learned the importance of this the hard way. Like most people who have built anything meaningful, in 2021, I lost a significant amount of money making decisions that, in hindsight, were strategy decisions when they should have been system decisions. I was paying attention. I was disciplined. I had a plan. And the plan failed in exactly the way plans tend to fail, because at a certain point, the conditions changed and my human reflexes did not change fast enough. That experience changed how I think about everything. I stopped believing in willpower as a financial tool. I stopped believing in plans that required me to be at my best every day. I started believing in structure, in rules that protected me from my own decisions, in systems that did not depend on me being right about the next move, because the system had already accounted for the moves I could not see coming. This is the shift that I think most serious people will need to make over the next decade, the era of running your own strategies, manually, with the goal of outperforming an unpredictable market is closing. The era of building or accessing systems that operate with defined rules, defined risk, and defined behavior across changing conditions is opening. The institutions have known this for a long time. The general public is just starting to learn. This is one of the reasons I built what I built, not as a pitch, as a response to a problem I had personally lived. Tools exist now. They are real. They are accessible. They are not the same as the old advice, and the people who are willing to look at them seriously will be operating with a meaningfully different set of options than the people who continue running plans designed for a slower world. 4.4. Your capital, your control. There is a principle that matters more than almost any other when you are thinking about how to participate in modern financial systems, and that principle is custody. Custody is just a word for who actually holds the money. In most traditional investment arrangements, the person whose money is being managed gives up custody. They hand the capital to a manager, a fund, a firm. The manager then makes decisions on their behalf. The investor sees a quarterly statement, receives reports, and trusts that the structure is being operated as described. This arrangement has built much of modern finance, and for institutional and high net worth investors, it has worked well enough for a long time. For most people, however, this arrangement creates a quiet but important problem. The moment your money leaves your direct control, you are now dependent on the integrity, judgment, and continued operation of the entity holding it. You are dependent on their solvency. You are dependent on their decisions during stressful moments. You are dependent on a relationship that, if it ever breaks, leaves you with very little practical recourse. The most important shift in modern systems, and one of the reasons I find them so interesting, is that they allow you to participate in sophisticated approaches without ever giving up custody. The capital stays in your account, in your name, under your control. You can see it in real time. You can pause it. You can stop it. You can withdraw it whenever you choose, subject to whatever rules your platform or broker normally has. The system, whatever it is, operates within the boundaries you have set, on the capital you own, without ever passing through the hands of someone you have to trust on faith. Think about this in any other context. If you hire a chef to cook for you, you do not give the chef the keys to your house and access to your bank account. You give them access to your kitchen for the duration of the work. They do the job, they leave. You retain control of everything else. The arrangement is bounded, the risk is contained. That is what custody-preserving systems look like in finance. The system has access to do its work, but only its work. The capital is yours. The control is yours. The decision to continue or stop is always yours. This is not a small detail. This is one of the most important changes in the relationship between ordinary people and modern financial tools, and it is one of the changes that the traditional industry is least eager to talk about, because the traditional industry is built on the assumption that custody flows the other way. If you ever explore systems like the ones referenced earlier in this section, this is the principle to anchor yourself around. Your capital, your account, your control. Anything that asks you to give that up is operating under an older model that you do not need to participate in anymore. 4.5. The mathematics of time compression. The reason most people accept that wealth building takes a long time is that they've been taught to think about it in slow units. The standard advice imagines an annual return. You invest, you wait a year, you measure, you compound. You do this for 40 years and you arrive at a number. The math is real. The math also assumes you're working in the slowest unit available to a modern investor, which is one 12-month period at a time. There is nothing inevitable about that unit. The choice of how often you compound is just a choice. It feels natural because it is what most retail products are built around. But the underlying math does not care whether you compound annually, monthly, weekly, or daily. The frequency of the compounding is a variable you can change. And when you change it, the long-term outcome changes dramatically. This is one of the least understood ideas in personal finance, and it is not because the math is hard. It is because the structures that make faster compounding accessible were, until recently, only available to institutions. Now they are starting to be available to ordinary people, and the implications are worth sitting with. Consider a simple example. $100,000 compounded at 7% annually, the often cited long-term average for traditional markets, is roughly $200,000 in 10 years. That number is the foundation of almost every retirement projection most people have ever run. Now, consider the same $100,000 participating in a structured system that compounds monthly at a rate that, even at much lower per-period numbers, produces meaningfully different outcomes. The difference is not linear. It is exponential. Over decades, the gap between annual compounding and more frequent compounding is a difference between a comfortable retirement and a generational outcome. This is not a promise. It is a description of how compounding mathematics actually works. What it means in practice is that a serious conversation about wealth building in the modern world cannot ignore the question of frequency. It is not enough to ask, what return am I getting? You also have to ask how often that return is being captured, what the structure around it looks like, and whether the capital is being deployed continuously or sitting idle for most of the calendar. The institutions have been thinking this way for decades. The reason their numbers look so different from the public's numbers is not just that they have access to better strategies. It is also that they are operating on a fundamentally different time scale. They compound faster. They reinvest faster. They use structures designed to extract value from time itself, rather than from a single annual moment. The technology to do this is increasingly available to ordinary people. The mindset to take advantage of it is much rarer. Most people, when they hear ideas like this, default to rejecting them as too good to be true. The math does not care about that reaction. The math just is what it is. I am not telling you this to push you toward any specific product. I am telling you this because the mathematics of time compression is one of the most important concepts in modern wealth building, and almost no one outside the institutional world is talking about it openly. If you understand it, you have an advantage. If you do not, you will continue running on a clock that someone else set, and you will arrive where that clock takes you. 4.6. You don't have to start big. There is a quiet myth in personal finance that says serious wealth requires serious capital to begin with. That if you do not have $100,000 or $50,000 or some round number that feels like a real entry point, you are not really in the game yet. This is not true, and it is also one of the most expensive misconceptions a person can carry. The most important variable in long-term wealth building is not the size of the deposit. It is the consistency of the structure and the duration of the compounding. A small amount deployed consistently inside a well-designed system over a long time will outperform a large amount deployed inconsistently inside a poorly designed plan almost every time. $1,000 is a real starting amount. $500 is a real starting amount. Whatever you actually have to begin with is a real starting amount. As long as you understand that the early phase is not about the money, it is about the habit, the education, the development of judgment, and the construction of a structure that you can continue feeding for years. The reason most people never start is that they are waiting to feel ready. They are waiting to have enough. They are waiting for the moment when the deposit feels meaningful enough to justify the seriousness of the decision. That moment never arrives. There is always a reason to wait. There is always a number that feels like it should be larger before you begin. While you wait, two things are happening. Your time is passing, and your money, sitting in whatever default account it lives in, is being eroded by the silent tax we discussed earlier. The opportunity cost of waiting is not just the upside you are missing. It is the downside you are accumulating in the form of a slowly devalued savings account and a slowly aging version of yourself. Discipline beats deposit size every time. The person who deposits $500 a month into a real system for 10 years will quietly build something that the person who waited until they had $100,000 to start with rarely matches. Because the consistent person was earning the most valuable thing in finance, which is time inside a system that compounds. Generational wealth, the kind that actually changes the trajectory of a family, is almost never built from a single big decision. It is built from a sequence of small, consistent decisions that over time compound into something larger than any single decision could have produced. If you are in a position where you can start with a meaningful amount, that is a real advantage. Use it. If you are in a position where you cannot, that is not a reason to wait. Start with what you have. Build the habit. Develop the judgment. Refine the structure. The size of the deposit is the least important variable in the long-term equation. The decision to actually begin is the most important one you can make. Most people will keep waiting. You do not have to be like most people. Part 5. The life on the other side. 5.1. What people do when they're free. There is a question worth asking that most people never sit with directly. If you actually achieve the freedom you have been working toward, what would you do with it? Not the fantasy version, not the first month version, where you sleep in and travel and do all of the things you've been postponing. The honest version. After the novelty wears off. After the trip ends. After a few months of not having to do anything, when the structure of your old life is gone, and the structure of your new life has not yet formed. What do you do? This is actually a difficult question for most people, because they have spent so long defining themselves by their obligations that they have not seriously imagined a life shaped around their preferences. The job becomes part of who they are. The role becomes part of who they are. The pressure becomes part of who they are. When all of that drops, what is left is the actual person. And the actual person is often surprised to find out who they are, because they have not had a real chance to ask. Here's what people who actually become free tend to do. They reconnect with relationships that mattered to them. They get healthy in a way they could not while running on stress. They sleep more. They walk more. They spend more time outside. They start projects they have been thinking about for years. Some of those projects make money. Most of them do not in the early phase. And that becomes part of the freedom, because they no longer have to. They get involved with their families differently. They show up for their children differently. They have conversations with their parents that they have been postponing. Some of them eventually return to work, but the work is different. It is chosen rather than required. It is shaped around their interests rather than around their obligations. It produces income, often more income than they had before, because the work that comes from genuine alignment tends to outperform the work that comes from forced effort. But the relationship to the work has changed entirely. They are no longer trading hours for money. They are spending hours on something that matters to them, and the money is a side effect. This is the real prize. Not the absence of work, the presence of choice. The ability to spend your finite time on things that genuinely matter to you, with people who genuinely matter to you, in ways that genuinely express who you are. For some people, freedom looks like presence with their children during the years that matter most. For others, it looks like a quieter life in a smaller place. For others, it looks like building something they have been carrying around for a decade. There is no universal version. The version that matters is yours. Your job, before you arrive there, is to imagine that version with enough clarity that you can actually aim at it. What would you do? Who would you spend it with? What would the ordinary days actually look like? Sit with that. The answer is closer to who you are than almost anything else you could write down. 5.2. The world changes when you do. There is a temptation, when you are reading a book like this, to think of freedom as a private project, something you build for yourself, in your own life, for your own benefit. And in one sense it is. The work begins inside you. The clarity begins inside you. The decisions are yours. But the consequences are not private. When a person becomes free, the people around them change. The way they parent their children changes. The way they show up for their partner changes. The way they treat their friends, their employees, their neighbors, the strangers they encounter in everyday life changes. The pressure that was distorting their behavior is gone. The defensiveness that was driving so many of their reactions is gone. The narrowness that comes from being chronically stressed is gone. What is left is the person they actually are, operating without the noise that had been shaping them for years. That has effects. Children raised by parents who are genuinely present, financially and emotionally, grow up with a different baseline than children raised by parents who are quietly drowning. Partners in relationships where both people are operating from choice rather than from pressure have different conversations than partners who are mostly negotiating survival. Communities populated by people who have done the inner work that comes with real freedom feel different than communities populated by people who are all running the same exhausting script. You cannot save the world. That is not your job. You can save your own life. And the part of the world you actually touch will be different because of it. That is not a small thing. The cumulative effect of individuals doing this work, one at a time, is how cultures actually change. There's a common objection that goes something like this. The world is broken. The systems are unfair. The deck is stacked. What can one person actually do? The objection is usually offered as a kind of intellectual sophistication, a way of acknowledging the difficulty of the situation. But it is also, often, a way of avoiding the work. Because if the systems are too big to fix, then you are off the hook for the part you could actually fix, which is your own life. Your own life is the part you can actually change. Your own life is the part where you have authority. Your own life is the part where the work you do shows up immediately in the texture of every day, and ripples outward in ways you cannot fully see, but can be confident are real. This is what my mother has taught for years in her own work. Inner freedom and outer freedom are not separate projects. They are the same project, approached from two directions. The person who is free inside finds it easier to build outer freedom. The person who builds outer freedom finds it easier to do the inner work. The two reinforce each other, and the person who takes both seriously creates the kind of life that quietly changes the people around them just by existing. That is the long-term consequence of the work in this book. Not just your own freedom, the freedom of everyone who is shaped by the version of you who has done this work. That is more important than any number on a balance sheet. 5.3. What are you actually waiting for? We are at the end, so I will leave you with the same question we started with, asked one more time, more directly. What are you actually waiting for? Not in the abstract, specifically. What is the thing that, if you were honest about it, has been the actual reason you have not yet started doing what you know you want to do? Is it money? You probably need less than you think. Is it permission? No one is going to give it to you. Is it certainty? It will not arrive. Is it the right moment? The right moment is a story we tell ourselves to avoid the moment we are actually in. Is it fear? Fear is real. Fear is also wrong about almost everything it predicts. Is it a sense that you are not the kind of person who does this kind of thing? You are. You always were. You just have not given yourself permission yet. Marcus Aurelius, writing privately to himself nearly 2,000 years ago, asked himself the same question we are asking each other now. He wrote that you could leave life right now. He meant it as a daily reminder, not about death, but about the present. Not yesterday's version of you carrying regret, and not tomorrow's version of you waiting for the right moment. The only version of you that has ever actually existed is the one that exists right now. In this moment, holding this. That version still has time. The question is what it does next with the time it has. You have done a real thing by reading this far. Most people will not. Most people will pick up a book like this, read a few chapters, recognize the feeling, get uncomfortable, and put it down. The fact that you have stayed with it tells me something about you. It tells me you are not actually waiting for permission. You are waiting for a sentence that breaks the spell. This is the sentence. You can begin now. Whatever begin means in your specific situation. The conversation you have been postponing, the decision you've been avoiding, the relationship you've been holding at a distance, the project you've been keeping in your head, the financial structure you've been meaning to look at, the version of yourself you've been quietly rehearsing in private. Begin. Not perfectly, not completely, not in the way that ends the entire question forever. Just begin. Take the first small action that proves to yourself that you are not, in fact, waiting anymore. The action does not have to be impressive. It just has to be real. Then take another one tomorrow, and another the day after. That is the entire path. There is no other version of it. The people you admire most, the people who have built lives that look like the lives you want, did not arrive at those lives through a single dramatic decision. They arrived through a sequence of small, consistent, real decisions. They began. They kept beginning. They allowed the work to compound. You have the same option available to you. You've always had it. The only thing that has been missing is the moment you decide that the waiting is over. Let this be that moment. Sébastien Guénette. Questions worth sitting with. Take out a pen and a real notebook for this. Not a notes app, not a screen. Something physical that you can hold. Turn the pages of and come back to later. Write your honest answers in your own handwriting. There is something about putting ink on paper that forces a different kind of honesty than typing ever will. And there is no one to perform for here. Part 1. What does freedom actually mean to me? In my own words, in my own life. If I had complete financial freedom, starting tomorrow, what would I do differently? What ordinary Tuesday would I want to be living 2 years from now? What am I currently postponing that, if I'm honest, is tied to who I actually want to be? What moment would the people I love, am I assuming will still be available later? Who would the 10-year-old version of me say I have become, and would they recognize me? Part 2. What part of the standard financial path was I handed by my family or my culture without ever questioning it? Have I personally examined whether that path still works in the world I am living in? What does retirement mean to me, separated from the version I was sold? What am I trying to retire from? And what am I trying to retire into? How much of my current time is genuinely mine, in the sense that I get to choose how I use it? How much of my income am I actually keeping in real terms after the silent taxes are accounted for? What have I been calling safe that, looked at honestly, is just slow? Part 3. What pressure in my life has been so constant for so long that I have confused it with direction? If that pressure dropped tomorrow, what is the question I would have to face that I have been avoiding? How much of my current thinking is genuinely my own, and how much of it is borrowed from people whose lives I would not actually want to live? Where in my life have I been deferring to authority or convention without having tested the idea against my own reality? How am I responding to the rate at which the world is changing? Am I adapting or am I waiting? Part 4. When I look at the financial map I have been operating from, where did it come from, and how recently has it been updated? What systems or tools exist now that did not exist when my financial habits were originally formed? What would change if I treated wealth building as a system rather than a strategy? What is my current relationship with the principle of custody? Am I giving up control of capital in places where I do not need to? Have I taken seriously the question of frequency, or am I still operating on the slowest unit available? What is the smallest, real action I could take this month to begin building inside a more modern structure? Part 5. If I actually achieve the freedom I am working toward, what would I do with it after the novelty wore off? Who in my life would benefit most from the version of me that has done the work? What is the inner work I have been postponing under the assumption that the outer work has to come first? What is the one thing I have been waiting to begin? And what is the smallest first step I could take this week? What am I actually waiting for? About the author. Sébastien Guénette grew up believing that freedom was not a reward you earned after decades of sacrifice. It was a starting point. Raised in Canada, he was taught early to question inherited frameworks, think critically, and trust his own judgment over the consensus of the room. That upbringing shaped everything that followed. His central belief is simple. Most people are not living the life they actually want because they have never been given the space to figure out what that life looks like. Financial pressure, social expectation, and the momentum of obligation keep most people running a script they never consciously chose. He believes that removing that pressure is not a luxury. It is the prerequisite for a meaningful life. He has spent his adult life exploring what freedom actually requires, practically, philosophically, and financially. He taught himself to trade and invest at 17, built and lost and rebuilt, and developed a body of work centered on giving ordinary people access to the kind of structural tools that used to belong exclusively to institutions. That work lives at sctsuite.com. But the work is secondary to the mission. The mission is this: that every person who reads this book moves slightly closer to the life they were actually meant to live. Not the life they inherited, not the life they settled for. The one they would choose if the pressure finally lifted and the noise finally stopped. Where to go from here? If something in this book resonated and you want to explore the systems referenced in Part 4, the path is open at sctsuite.com. There is no pressure. There is no pitch. The work in this book stands on its own whether you ever pursue any of it further. What matters is that you stop waiting. The rest will follow.